Hello, Mage fans. This is Adam Simpson, and this is another episode of Mage the Podcast. Today, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on the topic of paradox in Mage the Ascension. And we have discussed this topic on the show previously, but this is a key component of the game. So, like other key components of Mage the Ascension, we're going to be returning to it a couple of times, discussing different aspects of it and sharing different people's points of view. Um, Today it will be my thoughts on Paradox since I have not spoken on it yet, and it really belongs as a major component of the game for three reasons. One is it keeps magic secret. Paradox is a very good explanation for why mages are not operating out in the open for everyone to see. The mages in the world of darkness pretty much without exception, keep a low profile. They keep quiet. Even those who might let people know that they are a magician or they believe in magic, they don't show them the full extent of their power. They keep that very quiet because paradox will punish them very severely, even for coincidental effects done in front of average people called sleepers. Because if those effects are too dramatic or cause too great of a change, the forces of paradox will cause a lot of very real problems for the mage. So not only does it keep magic in the shadows, which is very appropriate for the world of darkness, but also in terms of rules mechanics, when people were, the designers behind Mage were creating the system, they wanted players to be able to use potent magic and do really interesting things with it. But allowing too much of that can quickly get out of hand. So they wanted a mechanic in the game to limit things so that at the proper times in the proper situations, the players could really use strong magic. But for the most part, they have a very good reason to do that seldom, to try to cover it up, and to try not to be punished by the paradox rules mechanics. And the third reason why I really like Paradox in Mage the Ascension is because it serves as a very good metaphor for one of the key ideas in the game. And that is mages are agents of change who are looking to change the world in small ways and large. And for anyone who tries to bring about change, there is a lot of inertia from society that they have to work against. When you come in with a new idea, the old ideas are there, and you have to shove them out of the way at least a little to make room for what you are offering. And so paradox is that metaphor for the way things have always been, the way people expect things to be, and you're going to have to push against that societal inertia in order to make the changes that you want to see. So the question sometimes comes up in discussions, can't you just cut the paradox out? Can you play Mage without any paradox? And the answer is yes, you can. I've even done it myself. Removing the paradox rules is really very simple. In fact, it simplifies the game. And all the rest of the rules work the same as they always did. I was playing a game years back with some of my friends. We were reading at the time some Japanese manga called X 1999 by Studio Clamp, and it was about wizards in the modern day who were really tearing up Tokyo and fighting their own little war. And of course, that story was quite different from Mage the Ascension, but my friends and I thought it was great. So we took the rules from Mage the Ascension, second edition. We cut out the paradox. We put it in a different setting without traditions or technocracy. We ran our game. We had a great time. But it was quite different from Mage the Ascension. So later on, when people ask me, hey, what were you playing? I don't tell them, well, I was playing Mage. I tell people, well, I was playing my own creation, because once you cut the paradox out, things work quite differently. So another thing I wanted to cover about paradox is player knowledge and character knowledge concerning paradox is really very different. And as a storyteller, I try to emphasize this with my own players. people who get familiar with the rules for Mage understand that when a character is creating a magic effect, if they botch their roll, not if they fail, but if they botch the roll, they get a lot more paradox than they would any other way using magic. And so players quickly fall into this groove of talking about it. Oh, my effect succeeded. Oh, it failed. Oh, I botched it. But you need to remember that the mages in the game setting are not thinking that way. When they are doing magic effects, they know how to do it. And if it wasn't for the weight of consensual reality that they're pushing against, they would succeed every time without fail. From the mage's point of view, when they do magic, sometimes they succeed, sometimes the force of consensual reality is too strong and it shuts down their magic, and that's a failure. Nothing happens, basically, unless the storyteller is adjusting things differently for their own game. Now, what we call a botch is when consensual reality not only shuts down the magic effect that the mage is trying to do, but it fights back. It decides that what the mage is trying to do is such a disturbance to the world, to consensual reality, that this needs to be stopped right now. And so paradox affects the mage. So again, the mage character in the game setting is not going to be saying, oh, I really screwed that one up. Where's my head today? I should try harder when I do magic. They're not talking that way. They're going to do their spell, and when paradox bites them, they see it as not their own screw up, but they were, you could say, unlucky. They were trying to do a spell that was too big, too flashy, or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the forces of paradox bit back and tried to shut them down strongly. I think emphasizing that now and then with your players can add something positive to the game. Now, the next big question that players have once they learn the rules of Mage is, how can my character get rid of paradox? And the different editions of Mage have handled this a little bit differently. I'd like to just have a chance to go over it briefly. In the first edition of Mage, there were only two ways to deal with paradox. That was for the player to accept a paradox flaw and reduce some paradox points in that way, or wait for the storyteller to announce that a backlash had hit them. And I did not see this spelled out explicitly in the rules of any edition of Mage the Ascension, but some storytellers will give a paradox flaw to the players and announce that they have to take that, and they will tell them what kind of a flaw it is. Other storytellers allow players the option to ask for a paradox flaw, and that reduces the amount of paradox that their character is carrying and reduces the amount or severity of a paradox backlash in the future. And once a player says, hey, give me a paradox flaw for 2 points, 3 points, etc., then the storyteller will say, okay, you are going to have a paradox flaw like this. And the storyteller, in every situation I've seen, the storyteller will decide what form that paradox flaw takes. Of course, in your own games, you have the option of players deciding for themselves what their paradox flaw would be, but that can be abused, and I really haven't talked to any mage storytellers who try it that way. So if it works for you, you can write into Mage the Podcast and let us know all about that. Now, in second edition of Mage, Satiros Phil Bricotto was the line developer at that point, and I believe it was he who introduced a new rule, and that was as long as the mage's paradox points are less than 10, and the mage does not gain any additional paradox, then paradox points will fade away on their own at the rate of 1 point per week of game time. And that proved to be popular because it shows up again in Revised, which is effectively the third edition of Mage. And there's a little bit of confusion there because I read in one point in the Revised book this week that if it's 10 or less paradox points, they will fade away at 1 point per week. But looking at a sidebar in Mage 20, it says that Revised had the rule that in order for paradox to fade away at the rate of 1 point a week, it had to be less than 5 points of paradox that the mage was carrying. So if you run into a little confusion on that in your own reading, you're not the only person. I think the 5 or less rule fits better with the themes and setting of the revised edition of Mage. And of course, Mage 20 continues with it's either less than 5 or 5 points or less of paradox. They'll fade away at the rate of 1 point per week. And there's also an optional rule. If a mage builds up to 10, then points 6 through 10 fade away at 1 point per month. Yeah, we could really get into the weeds with that, but I'm just going to pass on here. Let's see, the revised edition of Mage introduced a new way of handling paradox backlash when that occurs for a mage, and that was a simple chart. The storyteller would look at this chart and see how many points were being used for the backlash. Was it 5 or less? Was it 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, or more than 20? And then they would read on that chart what sort of effect should occur for the mage. That is continued in Mage 20 with the simple chart. However, it is a little more relaxed in the severity of the punishments than Revised was. And in second edition of Mage, things were a little looser there. There was one page with a few charts letting a storyteller know what their options were for different points of paradox. For example, if it's 1 to 5, you could do a minor paradox flaw. If it's any number of points from 1 to more than 20, you could have a paradox spirit appear. So there were just a lot of different options. So the storyteller was supposed to be familiar with that, keep it in his or her memory, and just use that at the gaming table. The paradox backlash chart from Revised in Mage 20 is quicker. It is faster to use. It's more convenient for a storyteller in the heat of play. But for my own opinion, I actually prefer the second edition method. I like to just keep that in mind, be aware of my options, and when a backlash occurs, I like to just handle it my own way. But that's just preference. Either way is going to work well for you. Now, the manifestations of paradox. There are 5 chief ways that paradox can affect a mage. The first one is flaws. A paradox flaw is when the paradox energy that has been building up in the mage releases, usually not quite as bad as a paradox backlash, which can be explosive, but sometimes the paradox flaw will occur right after a backlash, and flaws generally go anywhere from 1 point up to 10 or even 15 points, and there could be a whole variety of different things that can occur for a paradox flaw. We can discuss that more in a few minutes here. Also, second manifestation of paradox is a paradox spirit will appear, which are similar in some ways to umbrood or umbral spirits, but are really their own unique form of entity in the setting of Mage. Spirits are actually very interesting for me as a storyteller. I like to use them rarely, but really focus in on them when I do use them. Paradox spirits can appear at any number of paradox points for second edition, but for first edition, Revised, and Mage 20, they manifest only with a larger paradox backlash, and they bring a harsher punishment when they do. Now, paradox spirits usually have a somewhat human appearance. They are not mistaken for an average person off the street, but they don't appear as like a giant animal or an alien-looking creature. They usually have a quite human appearance when they do manifest. And I think that makes a lot of sense because Paradox spirits are enforcing consensual reality, and consensual reality is created by thinking human beings. It is a natural force. You could argue it's a force of nature, but it is one that is powered by all of the humans living on Earth. And so it makes sense when thinking humans is the source, that the manifestation of that is going to be something that has a somewhat human appearance and can speak for itself and can actually conduct conversations with the mages that it comes to punish. When paradox spirits come, sometimes it's to scold, sometimes it's to harass, sometimes it's to attack, and sometimes they simply seize the mage and pull that mage off to a paradox realm to punish him there. And paradox realms is another manifestation of paradox. So sometimes the question comes up, well, if the punishment that I'm going to give to my players is a paradox realm, then do I have to have a spirit seize the mage and drag him to the realm, or can the mage just appear in the paradox realm? And according to the rule books, it's very open-ended. Any way that you want to handle that is going to be fine. So don't be afraid of doing that wrong. Paradox realms are usually very small realms, and most people assume that they are in the Umbra. Mages don't know for certain where they appear because they appear for short times. They are very hard to track down, and there's a lot of poor understanding about them. But paradox realms are usually very small sub-realms or mini-realms where one or more mages are taken and punished by the forces of paradox for acting against consensual reality too strongly or too many times. And some of the editions of Mage, especially second edition and Mage 20, have some really great advice on different paradox realms you can use in your games. They advise that each paradox realm be connected to one of the spheres, one of the 9 spheres of magic, and use the realm that is appropriate for the type of effect that the mage was carrying out when the paradox problem occurred. Let's see, and then there's quiet. Quiet is a game term for a kind of magically induced psychotic episode or insanity, where the mage is not only suffering from delusions, but the magical abilities of the mage reinforces those delusions and makes them last longer, makes them more severe, even makes them physically manifest in the real world to cause problems for the mage or others who are nearby the mage. And the final manifestation of paradox in your games is physical backlash, which is usually represented as nothing more than a physical explosion, which causes harm to the mage, possibly to others nearby, and it excuse me, occurs very quickly. And when it's done, the mage simply recovers from the damage. Often that is aggravated damage, so the mage will have a harder time using life magic to heal their body from those wounds, which makes them more meaningful, I guess. Now, related to paradox is an optional rule that was introduced in the second edition of Mage. It's called the Domino Effect. The Domino Effect is actually not about paradox points attacking a mage, but it is about when coincidental effects are happening that are too bold, too disruptive, and the same kinds of coincidental effects are happening again and again in succession in the same place. It advises that the storyteller raises the difficulty of casting those coincidental effects. And that is because consensual reality is understanding that one or more mages are pushing the limits and they are veering dangerously close to vulgar magic, and it wants to shut that down. So the optional rule is to raise the difficulty of those effects. Another option is instead you could cause more paradox to affect the mages. In several editions of Mage, if a coincidental magical effect is successful, there is only 1 point of paradox. You could give more than that to reinforce the domino effect and let your players know that they are definitely pushing the limits in this combat scene. Now, Sorcerers Crusade is an edition of Mage, but it is not in the Mage the Ascension line because it happens during the Renaissance period. So it's an alternate timeline for Mage. The published books for Sorcerers Crusade focus on Europe, but of course you could base your games wherever you like if you're playing. The game is built on the second edition Mage rule set, and it also features Paradox, but it handles things differently. It calls it Scourge instead of calling it Paradox. And it has a different name for two reasons. It wants to, one, reinforce to players and storytellers that Paradox works differently in the Renaissance, which is roughly the years 1450 to 1550. The way it works differently is it's not as strong and it is not as harmful to mages. During the Renaissance era, the sleepers' attitude towards magic and towards what was possible and what was impossible was quite different. During that time, there was a large percentage of the population that believed magic was quite real, and that holy men and women could beseech the Christian God to cause miracles to happen right on the streets of Verona or any other city in Europe. And so because of the different beliefs of the average person during the Renaissance, consensual reality, as a result, was quite different. And that meant that Scourge is handled by you have one or more different dice in the dice pool that is rolled when a mage casts a magical effect in Sorcerers Crusade. Instead of rolling the dice and talking about Paradox, if there's a botch on the roll, you would add one or more 10-sided dice that are the Scourge dice. And you're supposed to have those be a different size or a different color than the rest of the dice. And if you hit a 1 with your Scourge dice, that is a boon, a good thing that will happen unexpectedly out of the blue. If you roll, no, see, I'm sorry, 1 was a bane, a negative thing. A 10 is a boon, a good thing that happens. So you could trigger Scourge accidentally when casting a magical effect, and something unusually nice will happen to your mage, just to show you that magic worked differently during the Renaissance. And some people say there's an equal chance of a good thing or a bad thing happening as a result of Scourge, and that's actually not the case. If you have more Scourge points built up in the mage and you're rolling, say, 2 Scourge dice, if one comes up boon and the other comes up bane, they do not cancel each other out. You get the bane, you get the negative result. So there is a higher chance of something negative happening with Scourge in Sorcerer's Crusade. But getting back to Mage the Ascension in the modern era, one of the big discussions that comes up around Paradox is Wild Paradox versus Mundane Paradox. And what that means is in first edition, there was only Wild Paradox. Paradox could result in something truly strange and unexpected. A Paradox flaw could give your mage blue skin, or rubbery limbs that bent backwards at all the joints, or just really strange, unusual things. And I get the impression that the authors of Mage First Edition intended some, lighthearted fun with that. It's sort of a lighter note that could come in unexpectedly to a game that was in other times often grim. And so something like blue skin or hair that was on fire but didn't burn the mage could be a little bit of fun in the game. When second edition came in, we saw more Mundane Paradox, and that was, if Paradox is consensual reality reinforcing the rules and shutting down magic and making life more ordinary and regular, then we should not have paradox flaws that would themselves cause more paradox. So in second edition, we saw paradox flaws that were more like a broken limb, or a buzzing in one's ears, or temporary blindness, or other things of that nature. Things that were a problem for the mage but were quite coincidental. If a sleeper saw the mage afflicted with this paradox flaw, they would just think he got injured or was having a bad day, or something else that was very regular. Revised edition went back to descriptions of paradox flaws as being wild paradox, and Mage 20 explicitly discussed the matter and said to the reader, there are two ways to handle paradox. There is wild paradox and there's mundane paradox. There are good reasons for handling it in either way. We, the authors, do not have a preference. It's your game. You make your own decisions with our blessing. So that leaves us with the question, which is better for a game of Mage? In my opinion, I go with the mundane paradox. I agree with the notion that paradox should not cause more paradox if it is witnessed by sleepers. So I use things like wounds, or temporary deafness, temporary blindness, etc., to be the flaws that mages will get hit with when they are in the regular sleeper world, on Earth, you could say. So is there any justification for using the more wild, fun, crazy kind of random paradox flaws? I would say if you are running a chronicle that focuses on the theme of mages being alienated from regular human society, then wild paradox flaws would be very appropriate. The kind of chronicle I'm describing is one where a mage will use her magic to rescue sleepers from harm, and the mage will put herself at risk to do this, and in the process she will get paradox, and the paradox would do something horrible to her body, change her skin color, or make her skin turn into tree bark that sprouts leaves, or horns grow out of her head, or some obvious, ugly, strange thing occurs to her. And the mage has to then flee from regular human society, hide herself away, and the idea is reinforced that you will never be able to have a regular life with regular people. You are marked by magic. You live in a world apart, and once you go through the veil into the mystical world, you cannot come out again. So for those kind of chronicles, yes, definitely use the wild paradox. It fits very well. But I do not rule out wild paradox in my games because I think it's an awful lot of fun. I think it's great if you just use it in the proper context. And for me, wild paradox fits really well if your players are in the Umbra, any part of the Umbra, deep Umbra, high Umbra, middle Umbra, etc. If the mages receive problems with paradox when they are in a powerful node or a well-established chantry, or in some very remote and significant magical place on Earth, like say in the middle of the Australian outback where no one comes at all. There's some place where there's a minor node and it is very remote and magical bygones live nearby. If paradox were to occur there, I would by all means let it be a wild and very magical kind of a flaw. And by wild flaws, I would use things that really stand out, really make for a colorful campaign. If I've got a mage in the Umbra and he brings down paradox, which is a little harder to do in the Umbra, but it can still happen. If the mage has long hair, then let it turn into snakes, a whole lot of small snakes that come into his face and hiss or even bite him when he is using magic, and whenever he's not using magic, they'll kind of calm down and stay behind his head and bother him less. Or say the mage will develop eyes in the back of her head, so two eyes will appear on the backside of her head, and of course she's got hair there, so they itch terribly. She can't close them, so she has double vision all of the time, which disorients her or possibly even gives her headaches. That's good for probably a 3 or 4, even 5-point paradox flaw. And of course, there's the classic mouth in the palm of the hand. This comes from an illustration in, I believe it's the first edition of Mage. So if your mage is at a powerful node and he is causing some magical effect that's going to silence people or give him a voice of authority to make other mages fall in line, and he trips Paradox, then a mouth will appear in the palm of his hand. It'll shout rude insults at him. Storyteller can get creative with that, and if the mage tries to reason with the mouth that he's seeing in his own hand, he finds out there's no personality behind it. It is just a very loud, very abusive mouth, and he's got to live with it until the paradox flaw goes away. And of course, you can have paradox flaws that are appropriate to the setting. If a mage is in the middle umbra, the spirit umbra, then his skin might turn into tree bark and leaves sprout out of that, and he is going to experience pain and stiff joints and maybe something else related to that. Because this is the umbra, you can even say he has skin of stone, which is going to slow him down, cause a whole lot of problems, increase his weight exponentially, but it also might make him stronger. I mean, out in the umbra, things work differently. You can get more creative with it. If your mage is in the astral umbra, the high umbra, the realm of ideas, and paradox flaw comes down on him, then you could say that whatever thought he is having at that moment will appear as a visual sort of hologram up above his head, so that all the other players and all the other umbrid creatures they encounter can see what the mage is thinking. So it is very hard to keep a secret. If they get into a fix and the Cabal needs to hatch a plan to get themselves out of some trouble, then they're going to have to blindfold this mage and get him to meditate and make sure he's not listening to their plan so that he won't give it away to any enemies nearby. If your mage is in the low umbra and gets a paradox flaw, then ouch, that's bad news. It's hard enough to be in the low umbra or the dead umbra, but to get a paradox flaw while you're there, that's a bad day. That's not a position I would want to be in. But an example of a strange paradox flaw could be the skin breaks and tears in different places and makes him look like an undead or some sort of a zombie creature. Or worse yet, the mage could glow brightly, which at first would give a kind of good connotation, make him feel good. We're used to seeing those kind of things in movies, but very quickly the mage learns that he is a beacon attracting restless dead and other awful spirits in the low umbra, and that is not a good thing. So that would definitely be a problem. Before wrapping up, I wanted to share two ways that you can use paradox as a tool in your games when you're the storyteller. I like to try and think of ways that paradox can be adjusted to serve the storyteller to reduce problems that are occurring at the table. And one thing I hear people complain about, and I've even seen it in my own games, is you may have a situation where there are one or more players who have decided they've got a small handful of favorite rotes. They are magical effects that work well for them, they think are really cool, and they use them in the same way to do the same thing again and again and again. Now, that's not actually breaking the rules of Mage, and if as a storyteller you're fine with this, then by all means let it ride. It's not a problem in that situation. But if it kind of bothers you, and if it comes across as something a little inappropriate for a mage in the world of darkness, then you are not alone. I feel the same way as you do, and here's something that you can do about it. You can have a paradox spirit manifest the first time that this player has a problem, and have the paradox spirit talk to the player character, and have it express somehow that it is seeing the same problem again and again coming from the same source, and now it's time to fix that. And of course, when the paradox spirit comes, you can have it just be a warning and then it departs, or you can have it be a sort of a harassment, which in this case, I know harassment is a really ugly word these days, but I'm just talking about the sense where the paradox spirit will continually scold and verbally abuse the mage or cause minor problems for them. Um, Even if the paradox spirit is attacking the player, physically attacking, then you can have it speak before it does, and in that way, in the game, the player can see that the forces of paradox are taking note of how he or she is using the same magical effect again and again, and it's probably time to change their methods. Now, of course, as a storyteller, you can simply walk up to the player after the game and say, hey, you're doing the same thing again and again. That's not how mages operate. They're supposed to be creative, dynamic agents of change. They're supposed to be living examples to other mages and other sleepers of how creativity can make life better. So cut that out. But of course, that is a little more heavy-handed and can be a little more unfriendly. And personally, I just think it's fun to try and solve these problems in the game while the dice are rolling. The other thing that Paradox can do for you to solve some problems is if your troop is anything like a few of mine have been in the past, you will have a player in there who really likes flashy, destructive, vulgar magic and runs the risks and doesn't mind dropping magical bombs in every kind of combat scene that comes up, or even twisting things around to make a clever coincidental effect that is just a fig leaf barely covering up a very destructive, horrendous kind of magical attack. If this player continues again and again, and you want to emphasize the idea to this player that, hey, Mage is about subtlety, it's about hiding in the shadows, it's about waiting for the right moment to be dramatic, not being dramatic every time someone turns around. What you can do is you can start having the paradox that this mage causes be something that affects the other players, something that carries over. So if you have a magical backlash, like physical backlash, explosion, basically, then make sure it damages not only that player, but the other player characters. If a paradox spirit attacks, have it attack the whole cabal at once and cause problems for all of them. If it's you could even have a paradox flaw that affects the entire cabal. And in this way, the other players are going to get upset, they're going to get fed up, and in the game, their mages will confront the offending mage and say, hey, this is getting out of control. You got to stop this. You're hurting us now. That's a line we are not going to allow you to cross. And some savvy mage players may take note of the fact that that is exactly how Marauders operate in the world of darkness. They show up, they do something flashy and dramatic. Paradox comes down and causes problems for everyone on the scene, and usually doesn't affect that Marauder. And so you may have the other Cabal members saying, hey, are you starting to become a Marauder? This could be really serious. What's going on here? And that might add a little flavor to your game. So it's something to think about. It's an option that is open to you, and hopefully you can make something out of that. Well, that covers my grab bag today for thoughts on Paradox in Mage the Ascension. I just wanted to throw out a few ideas there that might give you something to chew on. I'm sure you'll come up with better ideas than mine, and when you do, feel free to let us know. Those of us who operate Mage the Podcast love to hear from you and hear what you're doing in your games and what you'd like to hear more of in the future. So don't be shy, drop us a line. And before I leave, I just wanted to let everyone know once again that here at Mage the Podcast, we are wanting to know if there are any problems that you are having in your own games of Mage the Ascension, especially if you own a copy of one of the editions of Mage the Ascension and you like the game and you'd like to run it, but you never have, if there's anything keeping you back, we really would like to hear about it. Are there some materials you don't have? Are there some rules that confuse you? Is there something you don't know how to communicate or represent for your players? Or anything else that we can help you out with? Please let us know. We would love to see if we can give you what you need to be running your own games, because that is really our goal here at Mage the Podcast. We would like more people to be enjoying this great game and talking about it. So as I close out today, I'd just like to let everyone know that you can find us online at magethepodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at magethepodcast. Please subscribe to Mage on podcast and on iTunes. And if you enjoyed the episode today, there are probably other people who would enjoy it too. And if you give us a review on iTunes, it makes it easier for other people to come across us in their own searches and tune in and listen to our episodes and join the discussion. You can also find us on Google Play and the TuneIn app. So there are a lot of different options for you to listen to our episodes and engage with us. And we look forward to hearing from more of you. Well, my name is Adam Simpson, and on behalf on Mage the Podcast, I wish all of you some great gaming. And as they say, truth until paradox, baby.